happened about, just to fast forward now, to about 30,000 years ago, so for most of our species history, people didn't really have symbolic artifacts. They didn't really communicate using external symbols or objects. What happened about 30,000 years ago, and this is kind of a hallmark of evolution, is that adaptations tend to happen when there's a change in the environment or changing conditions. And what happened about 30,000 years ago was the last great European ice age. And what happened about that time was suddenly across much of the parts of the much of the world that was populated by humans, suddenly temperatures started to plunge, and the small game that people had been used to relying on. I mean, for most of our our species history, people have been sort of small game hunters, eating sort of squirrels and rabbits and pigeons, and living in very sort of loose knit sort of scavenger groups. What happened about 30,000 years ago as the Ice Age came was that small game started to dry up and a lot of the vegetation started to disappear. And people suddenly, it was colder out, they had to start basically banding together to survive. They were starting to live in caves, for instance. And the food supply, increasingly, again, they weren't able to find the ready food supply that they had been able to find. They started to hunt big game, like woolly mammoths and big, 8-foot-tall prehistoric cows, and they started to realize that they actually needed to collaborate to do that. Sort of anybody can kill a pigeon, but if you're going to bring down a woolly mammoth, you actually have to have sort of a team, and you had a larger organization, a larger sort of group of people living together in sort of increasingly growing settlements. So what happened as people were starting to live in these larger settlements, it was about this time that they actually started to create things like beads in huge numbers. This is also about the time they started making cave paintings. And it seems that this activity was actually a response to changing environmental conditions, where people suddenly had to sort of relate to each other in ways that they hadn't had to before. So when people were in sort of loose-knit organizations or loose-knit groups, you sort of knew who everybody was. You knew who your sister was, and you knew, so-and-so had this sort of status in the group. But you're suddenly in a larger organization, a larger group of maybe hundreds of people living together. It's not so easy to keep track of who's who. So there's a pretty compelling theory that a lot of this early symbolism was a response to that need to be able to communicate status or to be able to negotiate relationships with people that you didn't necessarily know. And so it's incredible. If you look at the archaeological data around this period, there were settlements where people apparently spent the bulk of their lives creating beads and ornaments. Maybe they just had a lot of time on their hands because it was cold outside and they were spending a lot of time inside. But it was obviously incredibly important to these people for some reason that they'd be able to create these sort of totemic objects. And what this did was it facilitated what has been called a release from social proximity.